If you would, open a Bible to Matthew chapter 9. I know your bulletin's going to tell you it starts in verse 18, but I'm going to ask you to jump down and begin with me in verse 35. I'll remind you, because you're going to get little hints and pieces of this as we go through today, about the overarching theme of this section of Matthew as we are showing the authority that Jesus has. He taught with authority. Now he heals and does all these other cool things with authority. If you fast forward to the beginning of the next story, he then is going to send out his disciples with authority, and that's super cool for us, right? We'll hopefully get to that next week. But today there's a string of stories that kind of wrap up this section that Matthew's been giving us about the authority of Christ and how he has authority over all aspects of life. I want you to be able to see that theme as we focus on a specific concept, the concept of compassion. So in Matthew chapter 9, if you would look with me in verse 35, this is really like the summary of the section. So we're going to start there and then work our way backwards. It says, Jesus went through all the towns and the villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. That one phrase is what jumps out as fantastic. That Jesus, he's doing all those things, and what a great little summary of all the events that he had been doing. Then it says that he had compassion. And I started wrestling. I'll be honest, I've wrestled with this all this week, the concept of compassion and what does it mean, right? And lots of different ways to try to work it out, but a basic definition of what compassion is to so identify with the situation of other people that you are then moved or prepared to act on their behalf. All right, so dwell on that for a second. So it says that Jesus looked at all of the people, he looks at us, and he has compassion, meaning that he's so identified with the situations, the helpless and the hopeless situation that these people specifically were in, that he was prepared to or moved to act on their behalf, to do something about it. So I want you to try to break that down, because what I need to do in my mind, right, is simplify it to something I can understand, is that compassion means to identify with other people and then to act on their behalf, all right? So that is a longer definition, simplified for simple folk, for me. Identify with other people and act on their behalf. Let's dwell on that for a minute. What does it mean to identify with other people? There's actually a whole spectrum here, and I dove into that even this morning and then just kind of left it on the crumbled table, right? We'll come back to it maybe one day, but a spectrum of what the concept of identifying that leads to compassion means. But I can tell you that it's more than sympathy. Like on that spectrum of reaction that we would have to those who may be hurting or suffering or whatever, sympathy is maybe the place where we start, but sympathy means to just have to feel sorry for somebody, right? Like, I'll feel sorry for you because X has happened. And that's it. Like, my caring doesn't move beyond that. I'm obviously not moved to some form of action. I maybe not even be able to relate with whatever it is that you're struggling with, but at least I feel sorry for you. So it's more than pity, but less than empathy. It starts there. But compassion is more than that, because compassion is where we start to identify with people and try to relate with who they are in the world that they're coming from, or whatever injury or problem is that they're dealing with. And the word for that really is empathy. So sympathy plus, like it would kind of be the way you would think about that on this spectrum, is that empathy is what it means to relate or to identify to others, to have an understanding, to try to relate to their world and their worldview of what's happening in their world, of an awareness of other people's emotions, and then an attempt to feel the same. Now, I'll be honest, this gets really difficult, doesn't it? Like, that's a hard place to be, especially if you're dealing with something that you've never had to deal with. I've struggled with this my entire, we'll call it a professional life. I say that in quotations. Is up until, 3 years ago, I've never really had to wrestle with death personally, right? Now, I've been around it my whole life. And I've been there so many times in somebody else's heartache, but my parents were still alive, and my grandparents were never close to me, right? I'd never known anybody that I was genuinely tight close to that had passed away until my mom died. So I struggled with this, even like as a trained professional, right? Like I struggled to have empathy with people whose family members died, who went through tragedy or something like that, because I'd never actually experienced it myself. And I made great effort, but I can recognize that sometimes empathy is difficult when you've never been through the same type of thing. It got easier for me once my mom had died, because now I know the feeling, right? I didn't have to pretend or imagine it. I had felt it. But I think that's where empathy is, and maybe that little sharp pain I keep feeling in my back where God was saying, hey, maybe you were being a little lazy up until that, is that empathy is trying to figure out the emotional connections that others are having, even if you've not dealt with it yourself. So pretending or imagining or using this gift that God has given us to try to imagine and see something that may not be real to us, but to do it because it's so incredibly real to somebody else, so that you can sense and feel and experience their heartache and their pain and their emotions for yourself. The fancy phrasing we use for that is what? Like to see things from their perspective, or to walk a mile in their shoes. Those are all the ideas, the way in which the slang that we use to talk about empathy and identifying with someone else. So I think it starts there. When it says that Jesus had compassion, it had to at least start there, that he looked at them, and I know it started with pity, right? And I'm confident it moved to sympathy. But knowing who he is, and especially with the word that we have defining it, is that it ends with a sense of empathy. Is that Jesus understood and related. And that's the whole concept. If you want to step back and take a 20-second concept of our doctrine of Christ and who he is that he became fully human, that he experienced and can relate to all human emotions and all human activities, even to the point of death. That's kind of that's the whole idea of him becoming fully human for us, is that he understands it, he knows it, and he can relate to it. So he identifies with the heartache and the difficulty, and then is moved to action. That's the concept of compassion, is not just the emotional connection, although you have to start there, but then a move to action. So relating to the point that you're willing to act to try to alleviate that suffering or that pain or that heartache or whatever it is that someone else is feeling. So that can show in the versions of just helping, healing, saving, whatever. Obviously, Jesus does the saving, right? But that's the spectrum of action that is related to the concept of compassion. That I identify with your heartache so well that I then am moved to action to try to alleviate your heartache. And because I have identified with your heartache, I'm able to do something that's actually helpful. Now, step back for just a second and understand that that is actually a pretty good global definition of the ministry of Christ. Is that he becomes human and relates to us, is able to relate to every aspect of our life, every heartache, every difficulty, whatever it may be, right? He has dealt with it and related to it, to the point that he is willing and able, he is moved to action on our behalf, ultimately death, right? Like that's the whole idea, the concept of salvation, is that he's moved to help us. And here's what's fascinating is you think about that as the global definition of Jesus' ministry, that he identifies with us in compassion and then is moved to act on our behalf to try to relieve us. That's a definition of what he does. And Matthew does a good job of this, because every time he uses this word compassion, which is about 7 or 8 times, all in the Gospel of Matthew, every single time this word is used, it's used to describe some form of human suffering or physical need. That somebody is hurting with something, somebody is struggling with something. Even the most loosely connected one will be someone who is basically poor and so in debt that it's ruining their life. But a physical need that is present among a human, every time this word is used in Matthew, it's talked about that. And that Jesus sees that, understands it, and relates to it, to the point that he's willing to act to alleviate it. Now that definition may be established in our mind. Let's go back and look at the stories that Matthew summarizes with that little statement. We're going to start in verse 18, where Jesus interacts with, a dead girl. That's really the only way to say it, right? So in Matthew chapter 9, verse 18, while he was saying this, a synagogue leader came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her and she will live." Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. A couple of interesting things. And remember, the way we want to look at these stories is to see the compassion that Christ has. We want to see what it looks like. Is notice the way it's written. While he was saying this, one of my pet peeves is when somebody interrupts me while I'm talking. And it's probably because I'm bad about that, because I think that every word I have to say is of so importance that it's more important than whatever you're saying. Like, I recognize that's true for all of us, right? Our pet peeves are usually just a reflection of our worst characters, but it happens at work all the time, and I'm just losing my mind, right? Stop interrupting me. Jesus is literally in the process of speaking, right? If you remember last week, or just want to go up a verse or two, he's giving this whole parable about pouring new wine into new wineskins. And even when you read that, you're like, I feel like there should be more here. Like, he doesn't quite finish the thought of that story. And I think that's why. I think he's in mid-sentence, and this synagogue leader comes up and bows down before him. That's the concept of knelt, and says, "Hey, my daughter just died. Can you come and help?" All right? Already we see what compassion looks like, is that Jesus is in the middle of doing something. And this guy comes in, and Jesus stops what he's doing to listen, to pay attention. And here's what's fascinating about that, because look at the way it's written. The guy comes up, he kneels before Jesus and says, "My daughter has just died." One of your versions may say is in the throes of death, right? Like, she's died. And the dad knows that. Obviously, who Jesus is, he knows that. And Jesus knows how this story is going to end. Whether he gets there in 5 minutes or whether he gets there in 5 days, the story is going to end the same way, because he's fixing to go and bring her back to life. We're going to get to that in a second. But what's fascinating is it says, the dad says, "My daughter has died. If you'll come put your hands on her, she'll live." And it doesn't tell us that Jesus said, "Hold on a second, I was in the middle of something." That's how I would have said it. It's like, "I'll be with you in just a minute, but my sermon is not finished." Jesus doesn't act like I would. He just stops and gets up and goes with her. And that's mind-blowing from a human perspective, because I have something I'm doing already. Stop interrupting me. But especially from his perspective, because he knows the end of the story. He knows it doesn't matter whether he gets there in 5 minutes or not. He doesn't go on behalf of the girl. Why does Jesus stop what he's doing and go immediately? On behalf of the dad. The girl's dead already, and she's going to be alive again. It doesn't matter what time he gets there. But the dad doesn't know that. Jesus immediately stops and goes in that moment, stops everything that he was doing to show the dad that he cares, to show compassion, not to the girl, but to the father. Now, I struggle with this. And I think that's one of the reasons this sermon jumps to my mind, and then I've wrestled all week with it, is because I struggle with the concepts that are playing out behind it. A willingness to drop what I'm doing to respond to something else. That's hard for me. Even if it's not necessary. One of the things that I'm learning, and I'm not great at it, is like Elizabeth and I'll be having a conversation, right? It's at the end of the day, we've both worked 10 hours, we're exhausted, and I'm finally sitting down with my phone, and I need to play Candy Crush. You know what I'm saying? Just that feeling like I need a couple of minutes and just do my thing. And I'm totally capable, because I'm just this smart enough to play Candy Crush and talk to you at the same time, right? I'm capable of that. But I've also been on the flip side of that, where I know she's capable of it, and I'm just telling her something, and she's over there Candy Crushing, and I'm like, she's not listening to me. She is. She knows every word I said, and probably most of the words I thought, right? Because that's what it is. But that moment of something that I'm trying to learn, because I see it from Jesus, he was totally capable of finishing the sermon and then going and raising this kid from the dead. But he doesn't. He put his phone down and he listened. He stopped what he was doing and listened, even though he was totally capable, way more than I am, of multitasking. He cared about not the daughter's life, that was going to be solved anyway, but about the dad's feelings. He cared enough about him to stop and to go immediately. Compassion already. a caring for someone else, even at the expense of your own activities and mission, that's going to come up again. And actually, well, I guess it sort of comes up right now because he gets interrupted on the way, doesn't he? All right. You pick up in verse 20, like he's on his way. He's literally stopped his sermon to go try to raise a dead girl to make a dad feel better about everything. But in verse 20, this woman shows up. And it says, just then a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She said to herself, if I only touch his cloak, I will be healed. And Jesus turned and saw her. Take heart, daughter, he said, your faith has healed you. And the woman was healed at that moment. He gets interrupted on the way. And I can relate to this as much as I can relate to anything I've ever seen Jesus do, because he's a man on a mission, and his mission is literally life and death. And I've never been on one of those missions, although they all feel like it in my mind, right? He is literally on a life or death mission, and someone tugs at the back of his coat, doesn't even speak, but he stops. And if you read it in Mark and in Luke, they actually have a much longer story. Matthew truncates the same story. This is where he turns around. He's like, who touched me? Who touched me? And his disciples are like, dude, there's 50 people here. And they're all trying to, what are you talking about? He goes, no, I felt power. Leave me. He stops on the middle of going to save a girl's life to figure out who this person was. And at first reading, especially in their version, you're like, oh, it's because he's mad about it. But then you see how he interacts with the woman. He's not mad. He cared about her too. And he stops in the middle of his mission to acknowledge this woman who's already been healed, right? Like he doesn't need to address her. He doesn't need to talk to her. It's actually one of those cool moments. He could just been like, yeah, I got you. It's all good. But he doesn't. He turns around and acknowledges her and tells her to take heart. And he calls her daughter. I struggle with that as well. I'm a mission-minded type A person, right? That's who I am. That's how I operate. And sometimes that's really beneficial. But a lot of times I can leave people in the wake behind me, right? Because every mission that I'm doing, at least in my mind, is super important. But I hear the story right here that when one of your kids comes up and tags on your pant leg, you stop. Because that's what happened with Jesus, is one of his children came up and tugged on his pant leg and said, hey, I know what you're doing is literally life and death, but can you look at this for just a second? And he does. That's a level of kindness and love and compassion. Fill in the good word there that is like just out here for me. Like I reach for it, I struggle with it, but I see Christ emulating it and showing me what it looks like. And I also can't help but recognize that at some point in my life, probably at multiple points in my life, I've been the one tugging at his coat. There are way more important things happening in the world than my feelings or my depression or my heartache. But when I tugged on his coat, he turned around and said, what's up? Take heart, David, it's okay. He gets interrupted on the way to go raise this girl from the dead. He acknowledges this woman, gives her like power and authority, recognition, like that. I mean, she's been bleeding for 12 years. This means she's miserable. She's sick. She's been considered ostracized because she's unclean. And he solves all of that in one moment, not just by healing her, but by seeing her as a person. And that's significant. And then once that moment is done, he gets back on his mission and he shows up at this synagogue leader's house. And it says in verse 23, when he entered the synagogue leader's house and he saw the noisy crowd and the people playing pipes, he said, go away, this girl isn't dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. And after the crowd had been put outside, he went in, he took the girl by the hand, and she got up, and news of this spread throughout all the region. So let's stop for a second. Like, she's definitely dead, right? Like, she was dead, at least the way that Matthew tells the story, before the dad came out to see Jesus. So she dies, he goes to find Jesus, they come back, and the funeral is already happening, which from a dad's perspective just sounds so uncool, right? But the funeral's, that's what this is. This is a description of a Jewish wake, right? They're making a lot of noise, the pipes are there. They've paid at least 2 women, because every family was required to do that, to come and to wail and to yell out loud so all the other neighbors would know, hey, somebody's died, you got to bring a casserole, right? So a funeral is happening, and Jesus walks up, and he acts in the face of like all common knowledge. And I want to skip this, but I can't help it. Like in the face of all common knowledge and beyond the scope of reality, he walks into a funeral and has the audacity to tell the family, hey, that person ain't dead. Dwell on that for a second. I've been to a lot of funerals. I've looked at a lot of people I cared very deeply for in the middle of a casket. And if anyone ever walked in that door and said, hey, they're not really dead, I'd have punched him in the face. Like, you're crazy. I don't blame the people for laughing, but they're not laughing tomorrow, because Jesus shows up and brings her back to life. Which is a whole nother thought, like just an aside to remember, like Matthew's theme of the authority that Jesus has. This is one he hasn't done before, right? He's healed a bunch of people. He's healed them from another city. He's now healed a woman without even acknowledging. He's done all these super cool things, kicking out demons, all these awesome stuff, but he's never beaten the barrier of death yet until now. Like, the concept of his authority over our ailments and our human life is actually now complete. Every other story from here is just building on another theme, which I think is what we're looking at today. But I just love, like, this is a whole nother level of healing to prove Jesus' authority. But pay attention to the context. Where is he? It says, when Jesus entered the synagogue leader's house. And there's actually a fun little note. I just called it a little bit studying this week. Like, this house exists today in Capernaum, which is where we think the story has happened, because he's gone back home. We'll pick that up in a second. The synagogue still exists. Like, they've unearthed the outline of the synagogue, and right next door is attached a little house, what we would call a parsonage. This building exists, and you can go to Israel and see the remains of it. Jesus walks into this parsonage, and he heals the daughter of a synagogue leader. Now, we don't know, but just speculate for a second, who the synagogue leader is. He's going to be a layperson, is usually what it is, like that's responsible for the order of worship, for making sure everything in the church is happening right, so that when the teachers or the Pharisees show up and they want to do their thing, right, everything is right and all the pieces are there together. So when you start to pay attention to the dichotomy that is developing in Jesus' life between his way and the Pharisees' way, right? Though we would almost see, and we have to be careful with this, but we can't help but see it as the enemies of Jesus and his disciples and the way in which he's trying to show us the kingdom of God. Where is this synagogue leader on that spectrum? Is he an enemy? Is he connected to those who are in opposition to Jesus? Maybe. We don't know, but it's totally possible. But does it matter? No, it doesn't. And dwell on that next time you think about Jesus telling us to love your enemies, show compassion for those who hurt you. He walks into a synagogue with the Pharisees right on his heels, because they're like in the next story. And he brings back from the dead the daughter of someone who totally could be preaching against him next week. That's compassion. That is a level of love and action that you and I have a hard time wrapping our minds around, but he shows us exactly what he means, and he walks the walk that he's been talking. So he brings this girl back from the dead, completely ruins their funeral, right? Which is a super cool thing to do. And then it says in verse 27, he's gonna run into two blind dudes. As Jesus went out from there, two blind men followed him. All right. So just picture, like, he walks out of the house. He's on his way somewhere. What we know is he's actually on his way to home. And we don't know if it's his home or just the place where he's kind of made refuge, or the place where he would come home at night, because we know he's basically homeless. We've already talked about that in Matthew. But in Capernaum, he obviously has some kind of headquarters that he goes back to. It's where he has dinner, takes a bath every now and then, right? So as he went out from there, he's going somewhere. We'll catch that in a second. It says, two blind men followed him, calling out, "Have mercy on us, son of David." And when he had gone indoors, the blind men came to him, and he asked them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" "Well, yes, Lord," they replied. Then he touched their eyes, and he said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." And their sight was restored. But Jesus warned them sternly, "See that no one knows about this." But they went out and spread the news about him all over that region. These two guys follow him around, which is actually kind of funny. You think about two blind men trying to follow somebody. Like, that had to be weird and awkward and difficult for them. But they do. They follow him around, and they're saying, "Have mercy on us, son of David." Instead of mercy, they get compassion, which I think is basically mercy in action, right? Mercy given with some form of relief. Jesus takes the opportunity when healing them to stretch their faith. The question that he asks in verse 28, do you believe this? Do you genuinely believe that I have the authority to bring back your sight? And of course they do. He takes the chance to teach, to stretch their faith, to help them see the world in a completely different way. But what I can't help but see is the beginning of verse 28 of when he had gone indoors. Some of your translations are going to say when he had gone in the house. And the point of that is like the preposition exists there, like the word the is in front of house in the original Greek. So like it's not just a house, it's the house, which raises the idea that maybe he's gone home for the day. This is where he's supposed to go home and wash his feet, take a shower, eat his breakfast, eat his dinner, and get a nap before going back to work the next day. So it could be nap time, it could be dinner time, whatever it is, he's gone home for the day. And these two guys follow him there. They don't just follow him to the house, they follow him in the house. Now, having lived most of my life in a parsonage that belonged to the church, I totally understand what this is like. If you've never just woken up or walked into your living room and somebody else is standing there that doesn't belong, you don't understand what Jesus is dealing with this. But I have. My family's been there before, right? These guys are just there in his house at the end of the day. Now, the proper reaction from my point of view is that you get out of here, I'll be back in the office at 8, right? I will deal with you tomorrow. But Jesus doesn't do that. They have 100% invaded his personal space. And yet he takes time for them. He talks to them, stretches their faith, heals their blindness. And I just wonder, if anybody else struggles with that. I'm totally fine with being a Christian up until 6 o'clock when I finally get home, right? Then leave me alone, please. Jesus' story here, I think, kind of flies in that face that compassion somehow has an on-off switch. They show up at his house, and he heals them. But they're not the only ones that come. It says in verse 32, so they go out, they talk about it, but it says in verse 30, while they were going out, a man who was demon-possessed and could not talk was brought to Jesus. So not only has he had one person waiting on him and his dinner's getting cold, now there's a whole nother one, and this guy's demon-possessed, which means it's super fun, right? And it says in verse 33, and when the demon was driven out, the man who had been mute spoke, and the crowd was amazed and said, nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel, but the Pharisees said, it is by the prince of demons that he drives out the demons. He's still in the house. He's still at home, probably at the end of the day. But this guy is brought in. And what's fascinating is that without request, he doesn't say anything. And even the people who brought him in don't say anything. Jesus just heals him, right? Almost as if Matthew's in a hurry. That's not the point of the story. This guy gets healed, which is super cool. Continues our theme about authority. But the point is that Jesus is being put out. His dinner is he's missing out on personal time, but he still has time to show compassion. And then you see the Pharisees on the outside. They apparently came to his house too, right? They're looking in the window. And the opposition to his ministry really starts to take form here. As the Pharisees look at him after hours, bringing healing to somebody in his own home, ignoring the invasion of privacy is there, and the churchy people have the audacity to say, yeah, he must be doing all this because of the devil. His opposition starts to take shape. So then Matthew, after stringing all these stories together, and remember, this is the end of a long string of stories of healings and demon cleanings and all these cool things. He then brings us back to our summary in verse 35, that he went through all the towns and the villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And I want you to hear in this summary that this is Jesus. It's a description of who he is. He's caring, he's loving, he's relating to others, he's acting on others' behalf. He is the embodiment of compassion. And we see Jesus summarized really perfectly in this 2 verses. But you also see that it's a description of us. It says that he saw the crowds, that's you and me, who were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And don't forget that that is you. Don't forget that we struggle with all these things that we see Jesus trying to show us to do. Don't forget that at some point you were completely helpless and Jesus reached down and grabbed you. That's who we are. Like, we are helpless and harassed, and life is difficult. Which brings us to the last thought, is that this is a perfect summary of who Jesus is and an insight into who we are, or at least were, and then a reminder that this is a description of others. That we are surrounded in the world by a lot of people who are still this way. Harassed and helpless like a sheep without a shepherd. What does Jesus say next? He said to his disciples in 37, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." Now, the truth is, this little verse is actually a setup for the thing that's coming next, right? He's about to send them out on some missional training, and we'll get to that, and that's super cool. But don't miss the connection to what we just read. We get this summary of who Jesus is, a reminder of who we are, or at least who we were, and that's also a reminder of how everyone else is. And then Jesus says, go get them, right? You know how these people feel because you are them. You have been there. So go and get them. Go and relate to them. Go and connect to them. And notice the way he says it. He says it's plentiful. There are lots of people out here who are hurting, who are suffering, and just the tiniest bit of compassion will completely rock their world and change their life, right? That's what Jesus does. But he says it's plentiful, but the workers are few. And then he says, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into the field. And I think he tells us really two things here. One is the obvious, as he says, ask for workers. Pray for it. Pray for God to call out workers from among your family, from among your church, from among the global church. There are people who are hurting. There are people who are dying. There are neighbors who are on their way to hell, and you know it. So ask God to send someone to their house. And then recognize that you may be the answer to that prayer. That when Jesus places a calling on your life, that calling is always to one of compassion. I think the way that these stories connect and the way that Matthew writes it is for us to see the compassion that Jesus has, and then he connects it to the mission that he tells us to ask for and to be a part of. And then the mission that's coming in chapter 10 is they're going to go out and do the same thing that he's been doing. And it's a description of the calling that has been placed on our life, and that is a calling for compassion. That these compassion stories show us what kind of mission we've been called to. So then we can step back and we can look at what Jesus has done. We see the little elements that pop up in these stories in the summary that we've just walked through. And I think we hear the ethical calling from Christ to you and me who have heard that calling, knowing that we're the ones he says to go. And he tells us to act as he has acted. To have compassion for others. You remember what compassion is? To identify with, right? To empathize with, to the point of action. To empathize, to try to understand and relate to people, which is difficult. I know it's the hardest thing I think about being human. But we can do that by asking questions, using our imagination, putting yourself in their positions, walking in their shoes, whatever you want. But to use the imagination that God has given you makes it possible to understand and relate to someone that's in a situation that you may have not ever been in. And it's necessary, I think, to then fulfill the calling that Christ has placed on us to act on their behalf. So think about what that looks like. To try to empathize, there we go, say with the sick. To try to imagine or understand what it means to be sick. And I've never been critically sick, right? But I've had a surgery. I know what it's like to hurt for a couple of days. I can start there, but I can ask questions. Man, how are you feeling? What's this make you feel like? How hard is this? You can ask questions. You can also sit down and take the time to imagine. I know it takes time, and that's the part we don't like, but to imagine what they're going through, how difficult life is in this moment, what their feelings are, what their heartaches are, what struggles they have physically in life. You can do that with those who are sick. You can do that with those who are depressed, who are downtrodden. You may not relate to it. You may not have ever been there, but you can imagine. You can talk to those who have. You can do a little research on your own. You can make effort to try to understand what it's like to look at a world through a glass that's mostly dark, so that you can relate to somebody and empathize with them and then act on their behalf. I think the place where this may be sometimes the hardest, but at least the most timely, is to empathize with what I would call the others, those who look and think differently than you. That's going to be political. It's going to be economical. It's going to be ethical. It's going to be ethnical. One of the greatest stories that you interact with a lot is thinking about the concept of immigration. Is that the idea of immigration and how we want to control that is great in theory until you actually meet an immigrant, right? And once you meet them and you know their stories, it changes the way you look at it, because you can empathize with them. The theory becomes a person, and a person requires action. So I think we hear the calling from Jesus to have compassion for others like he has had for us, to empathize with them and do our best to relate to their world, and then to act on their behalf. The giving of yourself for them, the making room in your life for them, the way that Jesus has done in these stories. It's exactly what we just saw. Let's pray. Father, this isn't easy. And I know it's not easy because it's not easy for me. And I have to bet it probably wasn't easy for Jesus either. I think his humanity is complete. And then he can relate then to how we just don't want to. We're tired. We don't have time or the emotional capacity to make room for anybody else. And yet that doesn't seem to be an option for him, which means it's not really an option for us either. Would you help us to see not just his words and this, the way that he lived and the compassion that he shown, that we would see both the command and the behavior as a calling to reaction, a calling to fellowship, that we would be able to wrap our mind around that this is what discipleship looks like. And give us the ability, give us the courage to empathize with others, to make effort to understand and to make room for them in our lives, to be sacrificial enough to act on their behalf, knowing that through that action, that through that compassionate love is how you will reap the harvest of the lost. And we ask that you would do that here, you would do it through us. And we ask that in Christ's name. Amen.